Hispanics, African Americans, Catholics, Muslims, Buddhists. There are so many different cultures that exist in today's society, but ladies and gentlemen, we don't think that we should ever put the minorities' rights ahead of the majorities. And that is why we are so proud on side proposition today to propose the motion. This House believes that national states should not support minority cultures to the detriment of the majority culture. Now, before I delve into my constructive speech today, I'd like to take a moment to briefly look at today's resolution and define some of the few key terms that have been presented. All right, we would define this House as all nations of the world. We would define minority cultures as people who constitute a small faction of society, and we would define majority cultures as people who constitute a great faction of society. Now, the model that we would propose today, ladies and gentlemen, is that we would restrict the government from passing policies, from passing bills, laws, anything like this that would directly contradict or directly harm the beliefs contradict and harm the beliefs and the well-being of the majority group, right? For example, we would say that in a country that is mostly or overwhelmingly non-Catholic, we would not pass a bill that is banning abortion because we don't think that this is right thing to do. So ladies and gentlemen, today what we think we need to do on side proposition in order to truly win the debate is that we think that we need to prove that the duty of the government is to protect and ensure the well-being of the majority, not the minority. All right, so today I'll be talking to you about two key points. Firstly, about utilitarianism. Secondly, about the loss of culture. And my partner Tatiana will later go on to talk about stability and legitimacy of the government. Now, without further ado, let's delve straight into my constructive point today about utilitarianism. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that when there are two opposing forces in society, that we are always going to go with the majority, that the majority is always going to rule no matter what we do, right? We think that the government can only protect so many people in society, and we think that because the government isn't capable of protecting every single person in that society, that they should be doing their best to protect the best they can, right? We think that in this case, they're doing the best that they can to protect society is to protect what the majority wants. It is to protect the majority people's rights. Let's take a look at elections, right, ladies and gentlemen? We think that elections are a key example of when majorities always win out. Right? When we hold elections, we think that, we write who we want to vote for, we drop it in the ballot box, and ladies and gentlemen, whoever gets the majority of the votes, they win. They are then allowed to make all the important decisions that go into our country. And even if it solely isn't the president alone, we see that this also applies in things such as Congress. We see that it applies in the things such as the House of Commons, right? House of Representatives. All of these cases, the majority always has the power to win. We think that as long as 50% or more of the people there do want something, that they are going to be able to have the upper hand, that they are going to have the advantage. So we see that this is a basic fundamental principle in our society today. Sure.
Okay, so if the majority would say to vote for let's kick all the minority peoples out of this country, would they be allowed to do that?
Okay, we don't think that we don't think this is right, but furthermore, we don't think that the majority of people in our society would vote to do this today, right? But furthermore, we would say that these minorities, if they aren't fitting in with their society today, well, they can always go back to a place where majority they find a majority. All right, let's get back into this point about utilitarianism, right? And let's take a look at another example. Let's take a look at affirmative action, as we've been seeing in the United States, right? We think that this is actually forbidding against quotas, forbidding against giving special rights and privileges to the minority people, because people have actually been complaining, and they've been saying that it's being discriminatory towards the majority. So ladies and gentlemen, have we not proven today that the majority always does ride out what the minority would want to do? We think that yes, there is a freedom of choice. We do give people the right to choose, but ladies and gentlemen, we think that if the majority is harmed through this freedom of choice that we are giving the minorities, we think that this is fundamentally detrimental because we don't want to infringe on the majority rights of our society today. So now let's take a look at my second contention today about this whole idea about the loss of culture. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure that it's like no real mystery today that every single country has its own identity, right? That it's something that they've accumulated through history, through all the wars that they've fought, through all the religions that have come past. And ladies and gentlemen, we think that when we have so many minority groups, and we think that when we are giving these minority groups so many rights, that these countries are actually losing their cultural identity. We think that when these people are giving so many rights to other people who are not part of their heritage, who are not part of like the general culture that they once established, this is actually like overriding the country's like national identity. Let's take a look at France, ladies and gentlemen. We think that in France, their immigration system means that these minorities or the people who do immigrate into this country, that they have to integrate into society, that they will no longer be treated as a minority group. They're only going to be treated as French citizens. And in fact, we see that in France, they also banned the use of the burqa. Ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look. Let's take a moment to imagine right now. Let's imagine the city of Paris filled with people roaming around who are wearing burqas. Would this still be considered France, ladies and gentlemen? We wouldn't think so. And it's actually, I'll take you.
Can you provide an actual reason why having a lot of ideas, a lot of opinions in society is a bad thing?
We don't think that it's a bad thing, but we think that it is a bad thing when it is harming the majority of the people. We think that it is a bad thing when they are overriding all of the rights, or like when they are trying to be put ahead of the majority. We are not saying that like we are against minorities. We are only saying that we are against minorities when it hurts the majority. So ladies and gentlemen, let's go back to like this whole idea about the loss of culture, right? Like we do agree multiculturalism is good, but not when it takes away all the individual traits that truly define a country. And ladies and gentlemen, it is for all of these reasons that I have just brought up to you, as well as for the reasons that my partner Tatiana will later go on to mention, that we are so proud to propose the resolution. Thank you.
We think that as a society and as a government, we have a responsibility to a lot of people. But ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, we think that our most important responsibility is to those who can't stand up for themselves, those who have been persecuted through their entire lives. We think those are the ones we need to protect, and it's on that basis that we're proud to stand in opposition to today's side proposition. Now, we think on this side of the House, for us to really take this debate today, we have to prove two main things. First of all, we're going to prove that it's inherently morally wrong to punish somebody because of their culture, because of the color of their skin. And second of all, we're actually going to prove to you why accepting minority cultures, why giving them more clout, giving them more power would actually help us. We're going to be doing that with three main points of contention. First, we're going to talk about why we need to support the minority. Second, we're going to talk about this idea of rights. And third, my partner Olomouc is going to talk about multiculturalism. But before we go into that, let's just go into some rebuttal of everything that's come out of proposition so far. So the first thing that I took a very big issue with was their model. They said the majority is basically able to do whatever they want to the minority. They said that if the minority contradicts the beliefs of the majority, there are no restraints, just do what you want. First of all, we think that's absolutely ridiculous. We think if a society of 60% of Catholics wanted to completely persecute 20% of homosexuals in that society and wanted to kill them, they're saying they can. They're saying these guys are not bounded by any constitution. We think even in the most racist of societies, you can't just go around doing whatever you want to anybody. We think there has to be restrictions. They haven't pointed anyone's out in their model. Second of all, we think, say, if a bunch of a society full of Caucasians suddenly had vote one day and decided to turn all African Americans into slaves, are they saying we could do that? We don't think they've actually provided any mechanism to stop that. No, thank you. When the back half asked the POI if, like, they wanted to kick a bunch of people out, they would allow them. What Gray said was, like, if they're getting hurt, they should just go back to where they're from. We think being in a society that's free, we think considering ourselves the Western world, a society that considers freedom over all, do we just tell people, go back to your homes? We don't think that's right. We think they're just being inherently racist on side proposition. We don't think we can stand up for that. So the argumentation that Grace tried to bring up is this idea of utilitarianism. And the only real justification she had for it was elections. She said, well, through elections, we vote for people. So this isn't really any different. So we think the response to that is we don't think that Barack Obama could decide one day, since he's president, since he was elected, to kill every single white person in the United States. We don't think that's how it works. We think elections and we think politicians are bounded by things like constitution, are bounded by things like morals. And simply just because the majority says something, that can't stand. Again, we continue to think they're wrong. Sure.
Well, we're not promoting any kind of hurting these minorities. We're just saying we're not going to support them in the cases when they are hurtful to us.
Okay, so if a white person considers living next to a Muslim hurtful, considers living next to a Muslim who might be a terrorist something that hurts them personally, and if a majority of the people in that community vote against that, are we going to say, okay, you can kick that Muslim out? We don't think that's the way it works. We think that's inherently racist. We're disgusted by the opinions coming out of side proposition. So let's continue with elections. So again, we think they're bounded by constitutions. It's not very easy to do anything. Then she talked about loss of culture. Again, we think identity is actually built up through people being together, and beyond that, we think cultures are actually good. My partner Moloch is going to address that. So with that said, let's move on to our actual constructive. First, let's talk about the rights of the minority. So first, I'm going to talk about this idea of a majoritarian dictatorship. We think just because you're a majority of the people, you can't decide what you want to do to the minority. Say 51% of a majority decided to do something, we don't think they can simply hurt the other 49%. We think those 49% constitute a very, very large, very powerful sanction of society. We don't think we can just get rid of them. We've seen in many Middle Eastern countries where even though a majority of people want to persecute Christians and they can go along doing that, we think that's something wrong. That's not what we stand for. It seems like proposition does. Beyond that, as a second subpoint, we can talk about the lottery of life. What that means is that I didn't choose to have brown skin. None of you chose to have the skin you had. None of you chose to be Muslim. We think these things happen through nurture, through the way you're raised, and through the way you're simply born. And we think to be persecuted against, to be told that you can just have your rights voted away just because of the way you're born, something you have no control over, we think that's inherently immoral. Yeah.
It's because of not of the way you're born, because it's because of the actions you take that hurt the majority of the people around you.
We think that's something they again brought up in that POI. We don't think the first half actually specified what being a detriment means. All they said is if you don't agree with the beliefs of a minority, you're allowed to go against them. So that's what we're running off. That's what they modeled. That's what this debate is about. Beyond that, with the lottery of life, again, we think that's absolutely immoral. And as a second point, let's talk about why the minority. Let's talk about why the minority needs the most protection. We think majorities actually have a lot of power in society. Majorities have unions with them. Majorities constitute a majority of society. They're the ones voting the politicians in. We think the ones who don't have any power are actually the minorities. We think the ones who can't just revolt and have their voices actually heard are the minorities. And the huge issue we see with this is our job is not to help the ones who have the most power, but to help the ones who have the least power. That's something that we stand by and we will continue to stand by. We think nobody else is going to be there for these minorities. We think nobody else is going to really care enough to help these minorities with the exception of a government. And that's why we're here. That's why we're proud to stand in opposition. So what have I really talked about today? We really brought you forward the idea on how the first half of proposition so far anyway has really just been the definition of racist. We talked to you about how their ideas about utilitarianism or the loss of culture are simple excuses for having a majority take away the rights of a minority. And beyond that, we presented to you three main points. We talked to you about how a majority, just because they have more people, doesn't mean they have more power. We talked to you about how because I didn't get to choose to have this color of skin, I shouldn't be persecuted for it. And we talked to you about how the minorities are the ones who actually need the most help. So ladies and gentlemen, Madam Speaker, we think it's for these reasons, as well as the fact that we've debunked them completely, that this resolution must and will fall.
We think that the majority... Oh, wait, sorry, can I use...
Her phone? I'm so sorry. I've been messing up time splits all day yesterday. Okay. We think that the majority of what we've heard from side opposition today comes down to a fundamental misunderstanding. What we impress on them right now is that there is a huge difference between not having the belief of a majority and having your beliefs directly harm a majority. We think that's what we're going to be stressing on side proposition. We think that's something that they need to really come to terms with. We think that that's something that's going to be carried throughout our, all across our bench today. And we think that that's just basically going to be the difference between what they've been talking to you about and what is essentially the truth of the matter. So today I'm going to be talking to you about what can happen when a government supports the minority instead of the majority and how this will actually harm the government and the country as a whole. Before that, I'm going to do a bit of rebuttal and reconstruction, then we'll get into my constructive case. So with that being said, we've already pointed out this idea of that there's a fundamental difference between not being a majority and going against a majority's belief. We think that we heard this example from side opposition that was completely ridiculous. We heard if a white person is living next to a Muslim, no thank you, and says they're a terrorist, they're hurting me, we're not just going to kick them out of the country. First of all, we think the majority of people aren't going to point fingers at that person and say you're a terrorist. We think, no thank you, that is actually being extremely racist and characterizing white people as those who are always suspicious of those who aren't like them. We think in countries like America, we're not just going to kick people out of a country because they're a different skin tone, because we think that the majority is actually rational. No thank you. Furthermore, we think let's look at gay rights, okay? We think that we've actually progressively had, no thank you, come to a point where the majority of several countries or several provinces or states are actually in support of no thank you gay rights. We think that that's because we've come to see that that's fair. We think they're assuming on a fundamental basis, no thank you, that the majority of people are always the ones with the racist and unfair views. No thank you. Even if the majority of a country is white, Caucasian, whatever, Asian, no thank you, whatever ethnicity they may be, we think that that doesn't mean they all have the same views, and that doesn't mean that they're going to be discriminating against the minorities. No thank you. So let's look at this quick model quibble we've had here today. We've heard this idea that we think that they haven't really defined detriment. We think their model is a little unclear. Let us clear that up for you. No thank you. We think that detriment is defined as when it directly harms or prevents a person from practicing their belief. We think that if the majority of a country is non-Catholic and someone wants an abortion, the government should not say, no, actually I'll take you in a moment, because 10% of our people are Catholic, you cannot have an abortion. Yes?
This example is really relevant under your model. Grace just told us that the majority can do anything in parliament, that because they're the majority, they can't force through abortion laws under your model. So please name a relevant example of how a minority can, without a democratic majority, actively harm a majority culture.
Okay, we think that ultimately they can't because we're not going to let the government have that opportunity. We think that we're not going to let the government pass laws that are going to be harming the majority because we think that that's the logical course of action. We think if we get up here and say the government should be passing laws that are directly going to support all of the minorities in a way that ultimately harms, no thank you, and prevents the majority belief from being practiced in that country, we think that that's unfair. No thank you. We recognize that sometimes this discrimination or sometimes not supporting minorities is unjustified. However, we think that supporting the minority over the vast majority, no thank you, of citizens is not only unjustified, but it's illogical. And that's basically what we're telling you today on side propositions. So let's get into some quick rebuttal from the rest of what we've heard. We heard this idea about, the lottery of birth. We don't think that's fair. Okay, we think that ultimately, yes, you're born the way you are. You're born in a country. No thank you. Unfortunately, that's the way it is. There's nothing we can do to change that. However, we see that in the same way, you can have the lottery of birth of being born into a majority, and we don't want that majority to be harmed because we think that's most people in the country. We think that ultimately it's a smart choice for the government to support those people, and that's what we're fundamentally saying. So no thank you. So finally let's move on to this constructive case that my partner and I have built today. We're going to be finishing it off with this final point about stability and the legitimacy, no thank you, Arsalan, of the government. So we think that what ultimately happens when rights are being taken away
from large groups is they get upset. We think that's like a general fact of life. We think that when people aren't allowed to like get married because they might be homosexual, we think that they get upset. We think that the people who believe that's okay get upset. No, thank you. We think everyone gets upset. We think that that's something we don't really want to happen. But furthermore, like, let's look at, no, thank you, like countries where where we see religion coming into play. We think like in the Middle East, there are several countries with minority and majority religions, and we think that if like suddenly we take a country that has, no thank you, a majority religion, like say Israel, and say, well, suddenly we're going to pass all of these laws that contradict all of your beliefs, prevent you from practicing it, and support every other religion. No thank you. Well, that's okay, and we're just going to do that anyways. We think what's going to happen is those people are going to get, no thank you, very unhappy, and we think that what happens in that case is that they actually become angry, and we find like political upset. We find like discourse. We find like a lot of people getting very, very upset at each other. No thank you. Maybe like revolting against the government. We see that like, no thank you. We've seen this in several countries before. Like, what we would say to this is ultimately we're going to prove to you in two cases why this is true and why that, no thank you, the government should not be supporting the minority above the majority. So first, let's look at a democratic government. We think that this government has been elected by a majority of people who share their beliefs if they have a majority government, like as Grace mentioned. We think that in that case, it's pretty, no thank you, smart of them to be supporting the majority of people who voted for them. We think that's a fact because that's how they stay in power. No thank you, we think that that's logical, we think that that supports their people, we think that this is like ultimately the best decision. Furthermore, like we think that's the way that like countries work, we can't really change that, but let's look at the cases of dictatorships. We think that when you have a dictator, if the dictator wants to stay in power and not have people rebelling against him, like in Syria, we think that they need to do at least something to appease the people. We think that when you get the majority of the people upset against you and rebelling against you, you're not fulfilling this. You're not actually making a smart move. So it's because even though in some cases we think that, yes, maybe it may be unfair to those who are a minority, we think it's more unfair to oppress the majority, and we think it's more unfair to harm the most people instead of like the least and instead of those who actually don't have the majority of belief in the country, that we are so proud to propose this resolution.
I now call upon the second speaker of opening opposition to deliver a speech on
Tell me why India is the only country in the world that does not accept Sikhism as a proper religion, but as a branch of Hinduism. Tell me why that India has been trying since 1940s to assimilate Sikhism into Hinduism. We think by the model or by the resolution proposed by the proposition today, they will only be furthering this idea of assimilation. They will only be allowing governments who are currently in nations right now, as was defined as all nations of the world, will further promote this. We think this is harmful for a host of reasons, and I'm going to be proving that and much more. And I'm also going to be bringing forward the third constructive point of the opposition case today, the idea of the benefits of multiculturalism. But before I do that, I want to get into some extensive refutation of what we have heard from the proposition side today. We heard this idea of firstly passing bills. We think it's very harmful when culture or religion is used as the guiding post of policy. We think we shouldn't be doing this, primarily because religion, we think there's a certain separation between this church and the state, but moreover cultures as well. We would say that, we shouldn't be saying abortion laws can't be passed in the country because majority of people are Catholic. We need to actually weigh the pros and cons of certain things, analyze the country, and see whether abortion is actually required in that country and shouldn't be predicated upon the idea of whether people are Catholic or not. Let's get into what they said in their main constructive arguments today. Firstly, we heard this idea of utilitarianism. They said protecting the majority, that this is the pillar of democracy, that democracy is predicated upon the majority. We think, one, it's important that governments cater to everybody within a country, because democracy is even more predicated upon the pillar of equality, that people are equal, and moreover, majority and minority should be treated the same, and that like insofar that we allow equality in our countries, why is it exactly that people are then persecuted or prevented from practicing their culture because of the lifestyle choice that they chose? We think that this is actually going against democracy. We think governments need to cater to everyone. When governments are passing bills, they need to analyze in which regions a certain bill needs to be passed, not because it's going to make the majority culture angry. Let's talk about the second point they brought forward, this idea of loss of culture. And they said, culture is accumulated over time, and France, banning the use of the burqa. We would say, firstly, what exactly was the harm of individuals wearing burqas within France? We would say this is not a detriment. We say they banned the burqa, and we think that this is completely oppressive to the Muslim minority. We think that this is what actually goes against the pillars of democracy, goes against freedom of religion. And we think that this is very oppressive, and we think that this is detrimental. Furthermore, we would say okay, when can we see instances where the majority culture feels threatened? We would say post 9/11 United States of America, where we saw that people were threatened by seeing Muslim culture. They didn't want to see Muslim culture. When you promote this resolution, what you do is you allow government to then cater to those people and further suppress the Muslim minority within those areas because the majority culture doesn't like it. We think this is harmful and against the pillars of democracy. We think what this does is oppress people, even though some radicals off somewhere else are doing things. We don't think this is correct on a moral basis. Let's really analyze further the perception of detriment. How does different people perceive a detriment to their culture? If we take, for example, Iran, where 98% of the people in a referendum voted for Sharia law. Well, in that case, the Christian minority or other minorities that have different cultures, them practicing their culture would simply go against the laws of the government. We think that this is further oppressive, and then if we allow this in other nations around the world, what this does is then further those individuals' oppressiveness. What this does is not allow people who have just chosen to live in that country, but because 90% of the people want it, I'll take you in a moment, that it suddenly should be allowed. This is completely abhorrent on a moral basis, yes.
Okay, do you think that it's a generally smart, really overwhelmingly popular decision to move into a country where your religion or ethnicity or whatever is
okay, the minorities within those cultures didn't choose Sharia law. The 2% of people within that country didn't say, oh, we'd love a Muslim government, we'd love Muslim laws. But what we say is that those people within those countries should not suffer. We would say people within those countries shouldn't then have now this resolution which is going to further promote policies that go against them and that go against them practicing their culture. And once again, as I've said, the perception of detriment is very different in different nations. It's not always, oh, we're actually actively being hurt. There's actively practical harms against us. They can perceive it in different ways, as I brought forward the post 9/11 example. Now, we heard them further say we can't hurt minorities because the government's because the governments can't pass things like this because there's safeguards against them. But we just heard Grace say that basically we can. If the majority wants something done, it's going to happen because it's a majority. We think this is bad. Furthermore, let's talk about the last thing we heard in the second proposition, the idea of Israel, and how when they pass laws that contradict beliefs, the majority culture doesn't get happy. We think within certain countries, we don't have the military for no reason. We think a government that cannot contain its situation, cannot contain its people, and has to hurt minorities to maintain peace within that country simply isn't a fully functioning good country. And we would say suppressing minorities is not justification on that basis. No, thank you. I'm moving to my constructive point today, the benefits of multiculturalism. We think what's most harmful about the resolution today is that it promotes assimilation. Is the idea of assimilating a bunch of cultures into primarily the majority culture. And what this does actually is prevent multiculturalistic societies. When the minority culture is constantly being suppressed and halted by governments. We think this is actually going to happen. I brought forth the Sharia law example in Iran. I brought forward, democracies like post 9/11 USA. We could bring forth examples like Texas. In Texas, we see an area where it's not really religiously tolerant, where they're not tolerant of different cultures. By promoting the resolution today, we allow state governments to then promote more policies towards doing this. So we think that we see that actively this will be used to suppress minorities. So we think we've proven that countries will do this, abuse this principle, and hurt minorities. Now, on a practical basis, we think this is bad because it prevents multiculturalism. And we think we need multiculturalism primarily because interaction of different cultures is needed for acceptance of minorities. Understanding certain cultures destroys media propaganda and stereotypes as well that is on those different cultures. We think post 9/11 USA, it was important that people interacted with the Muslim culture to see, oh, these guys actually aren't terrorists. And furthermore, right now there's a stigma that, oh, they're really oppressive to women. We don't think that's true. We think actually Muslims have a lot of rights for women, that actually the Muslim religion and the Muslim culture in itself doesn't necessarily oppress women as much as we believe. Now we think that on the basis of destroying these propaganda, destroying these stereotypes, we think it's important that we have interaction, but this policy today does not allow interaction of different cultures. It suppresses that cultures. We are proud to oppose the resolution today.
In the vast majority of cases, the minorities do not harm the majority. This debate is only about those times where they actually cause harm. This debate is about when we see cultural contradictions between the minority and the majority. What I'm going to do in my extension is I'm going to bring up real-world examples to show where this line is drawn, and this is something that we think that both sides of the debate have missed so far. But before I go into my extension and show exactly where we draw the line, let me just do some rebuttal. Firstly, we think it's highly offensive to call the US and most Western countries bigoted, hateful countries. We think that our majority culture in these countries is one of freedom and tolerance. And if anything, the people who are actually hating Muslims or black people or any type of thing, they are the minority that we want to remove from the public discourse. We don't want them because essentially they're harming the culture of tolerance that we have in those countries. Now, what we think is that, for instance, culture is evolutionary. We heard the idea that, okay, in India there's some religious problems due to culture and so on. We think that this will probably change because of, interactions with other people across the world, and we completely accept that. Like, it's a problem right now, but that's probably going to change. But that's because the majority of the population will probably think that's a good thing, eventually. I mean, sure, there are some short-term harms. We accept that. But culture is evolutionary. It, changes over time. Then we have this entire idea of the government will have to cater to everyone, won't cater to everyone. We think it will, because we think that the vast majority of countries will still make laws, that are fairly reasonable. It's not like we're going to oppress minorities. It's only in the cases where they harm the majority. And this is a distinction they clearly haven't understood. Then we have lastly, this example of Iraq. And I'm just going to say, yes, it is influenced by Sharia law, but they're doing it in such a way where you can still, exist and live in Iraq without being oppressed because of Sharia law. And they even said that Muslims themselves do not oppress women. Literally, that's what he said. I mean, seriously, either they have a contradiction there, or maybe Muslims in different countries are different. I don't know. Anyways, moving on to my extension, and I'm going to show you exactly where we draw the line. Essentially, we think that there are 4 areas where we draw this line. Firstly, in terms of the legal system. Secondly, in terms of healthcare and general public health. And thirdly, in the education system. And fourthly and lastly, in terms of protecting social norms. So, beginning with this legal system, where do we think that minority cultures cross the line? We basically think it's when they do something harmful to the majority within the public domain. And this is really important. Essentially, if they're committing a crime in the public domain, we think that this is bad. Essentially what they're doing is, because of some cultural norms and so on, they're pretty much just saying, okay, we're not going to believe in, we're not going to respect and uphold the laws that exist within this country. For instance to this, let's take, Woodstock. Drugs and, dangerous other things. We think that, promoting drugs in a country where you have laws against drugs is probably a bad thing. Because essentially what you're saying is drugs are okay, even though the government pretty much has a war against drugs, just look into that later on. Anyways, then we believe that some fundamental rights, such as women's gender equality and so on, pretty much gets hampered when we have small minority groups that might not actually believe in women's rights. We think that most countries have these fundamental rights that they believe in. I'll take you in a second. And essentially, when the minority groups harm these fundamental rights, that's where you go in and say, no, you've gone too far. We can't allow it. Yes.
So basically what you're saying is, if a minority does a crime, that's a harm against the majority. It's not our burden to show why breaking laws is a good thing. That's not also not the burden you have to prove.
I completely disagree with that. I'm just going to keep moving on. So anyways, in terms of healthcare, right? When we see, fundamentalist Christians in the U.S. bombing abortion, clinics and, attacking stem cell researchers, we think they've gone too far. If they take their personal belief and basically attack people within, this public domain, even though the majority think that stem cell research is okay, that abortion should be okay, we think that they've gone too far. And even protecting the welfare and health of children, right? For instance, what happens when, a Jehovah's Witness, a couple of parents pretty much have a daughter or, son who's pretty much, he needs a, new kidney, right? Because of Jehovah's Witness, that religion, right? Essentially, they can't do that. They can't even transfer blood. And essentially, what we're saying now is, okay, no, we should respect their religion and we should let this kid possibly die. We don't think that's okay. We think that, that kids should probably choose that religion after he reaches, maybe the age of consent. Then he can choose. Until then, we think the state has an obligation to protect this person And, you know, we think that's a good thing. Then we have the idea of education, right? Like, we think that in many cases, like, education is probably one of the most important things for social inclusion. We want minority groups to be able to interact and be part of the public discourse, right? For instance, learning a language is pretty important. Like, for instance, we see second-generation Turks in Berlin, for instance, not even being able to speak German because we have enclaves in, you know, Berlin. Like, literally, Istanbul is the first, like, ranked in terms of, you know, Turkish population. Berlin is number 2, and many of these people aren't actually part of the German society, even though they live in the German capital. We think this is like there's some type of contradiction there, like in terms of inclusion, right? Then we have this, you know, evolution for crying out loud. Like in many countries, you know, we see this backlash against evolution. I'm not going to talk about the U.S. I'll talk about Sweden, which is supposedly neutral and stuff like that. Like in Sweden, we see that Muslim parents don't want Swedish schools to teach evolution. Now, the thing is, we have no problem with them stating those views. However, we have a problem when they go up and pretty much try to force everyone, the majority of the population, to uphold their beliefs. Like, essentially, we could say, just skip those classes. Completely fine. You don't want education for your kids? Go ahead and do that. But in the vast majority of cases, we probably want our kids to learn science, right? Then, like, lastly, like this entire idea of social norms. Like, we think that, let's take France, for instance, and the birthday, right? We think that France has a social norm of secularism, right? And we think that by having, like, you know, religious symbols out in the open, you're pretty much directly attacking the French cultural norm of secularism. And this pretty much goes against the, you know, culture that France has. Like, then we have like an example of, for instance, in Sweden, in Malmö a few years ago, we saw a couple of Muslims who were pretty much hitting themselves with chains because they were trying to remember a prophet who lived a few, you know, X amount of years ago. I don't actually know that. My partner can probably explain a bit more. But either way, like this entirety of self-harm in the public domain is harmful. Like, we think if you want to do something like that, do it in the private domain where you don't influence the majority. Like, if you can do something, if you want to exercise your culture, if you want to do these things, as long as it's not harmful to the public, you can do it in the, you know, public domain. If it is harmful, do it in the private domain. And, you know, for all those reasons, we beg to oppose.
No problem. Okay, so we basically agree on with second half that this debate hasn't been really very practical in the first half, very philosophical. We believe first opposition pretty much proved the philosophical case about why minority rights are very awesome. Our extension, however, will be looking at practical examples of cases of minorities and how they actually harm cultures, right? And we believe the biggest practical example has been missed by all teams so far, basically stateless minorities, like the Catalans and Basques in Spain, like the Frisians in the Netherlands, like basically the entire country of Nigeria and Belgium, where there are like 300 minorities, none of which have a country. We're going to talk about how this motion will affect those nations, which are currently stable, and will pretty much destabilize them, make everybody unhappy, and in no way improve the situation. First, a lot of points of rebuttal, 5 to be exact. First of all, already started with the POI to first proposition rights. Well, what if the majority decides to pretty abuse them, right? And the answer we got from Grace was, well, as long as they have an exit strategy, go back to the country where you're the majority, you're fine. That's why our case is basically about stateless majority, the largest group of majority. They can't go back to the country where they're the majority. So what they basically said was, the largest groups of minority we just don't care about, but we're fine with the majority abusing that. So we don't really agree on that part. Secondly, the point about utilitarianism, right? I believe this is very wrongly interpreted, utilitarianism, because what they say is, well, the majority is happy, so we have the most utility. No, because what we believe is that a majority culture, as they said themselves, will always be dominant. So a small harm to a majority culture, which allows a minority culture to flourish greatly, will only incur little harm to a majority culture, but great benefits to the minority culture. So utilitarianism actually falls on our side. We have most utility. Finally, about, well, no, thank you. Then going on to second half, right? Because they say 4 real-world examples. First 2 of which are saying, look, if a minority wants to commit crime or terrorism, that's bad. Yes, we agree to that. It's not your burden to show that breaking laws is a bad thing. If that was your burden, this would have been a very biased debate. It is, however, your burden to show, for instance, other examples, which I'll continue to now. Because then they say, education, right? We need them to be part of the public discourse. But that's the interesting inconsistency on a proposition side. What they say is this. They say, we need them to be part of the public discourse in which we can force our cultural ideas down their throats. Public discourse means an exchange of ideas, not forcing ideas down one's throat. So basically, they also lose the education point, whether we can understand each other or not. And finally, about social norms, they say, well, we all want you to do this. Well, basically, we say, if a majority would demand, or if a majority of men in the country would demand all women to walk around naked just because we like that much, doesn't necessarily give you the right, has been analyzed on a philosophical point by first opposition. We don't say that just because we don't like it gives you a reason to do so. We actually believe it creates large unhappiness on the minority part. That will be also my constructive point. Because what is the most relevant example for this motion? Spain, ladies and gentlemen. Spain has two great minorities. First of all, the Catalans, that completely cover the most economically viable area. And secondly, the Basques, right? The Basques have a completely different language, also like the Catalans, and both are stateless minorities. They can't go anywhere, and we have like this Castilian majority of Spaniards, which basically force their culture down on these people, right? Now, what do we see currently in Spain? The situation is stable after maybe 40 years because currently the Spanish government allows these minority cultures to flourish, right? Because they, instead of assimilating them, they say, all right, flourish, do whatever you like, create your own culture. We believe that it would be, according to this motion, the active harming of a majority culture. Because by letting these cultures allowed to flourish, the Spanish culture, the Castilian culture actually shrinks, therefore is harmed. We believe that is a relevant example, right? So, what do we see in the status quo in these countries, but this also goes for instance Nigeria, Belgium, and I can actually fill 7 minutes with a list of state and majority Tibetans, but let's work on analysis rather than that, right? We see first of all, minority rights right now are respected. They can do whatever they like, even if that means like promoting other culture than the majority culture, right? Secondly, we say, because they are allowed to have this culture, and because they're allowed to have their own say in what they like to do, except from, say, foreign policy and military policy, they are actually consenting to the Spanish government. We say, okay, we're fine as long as you govern us from Madrid with foreign policy and things, just don't tell us what to educate our kids, right? And that is how we get certain stability. First of all, and lastly, very importantly, majority culture there, the Castilian culture, is still very dominant in that country, right? That's what always will be, as first proposition explains. So what would happen under this plan? We would send a signal from the majority to the minority that says two things. One, we don't respect your culture, right? We say, no, you can't flourish your culture. We feel threatened that our culture is somewhat superior, apparently, because there's more of us, therefore it must be superior, and you just have to take our culture, right? First of all, we believe that's very, like, culturally biased. We think, like, cultures can be like this complete marketplace of ideas, where you can pick, like, anything you like from several cultures. POI first. Yeah.
Okay, so you think that the majority of people in the world think that the existence of another culture is directly harming them and preventing them from practicing their culture?
No, I'm saying that would be the relevant case in this debate, basically, because harming culture is like shrinking that culture, preventing its possible existence on the longer term. We believe that is the relevant part, not bombing abortion clinics or voting abortion, as you said it, but the majority will never allow, as you conceded after my second POI. All right, continuing, right? So, secondly, they say, as first proposition or opposition already said, they feel threatened by you. But what we see, however, is that you get a backlash because of this signal, right? So what you get is actually on 3 different levels. We're going to differentiate between several social groups. You have a large group of moderates in every country. They're going to be unhappy. They link their identity to this part of culture, to this part. That's their identity. They're happy because of it. They feel Catalan, no thank you. And as a result of that, they believe that as soon as that's suppressed, they think, no, I don't want to become Spanish, I don't like being Spanish, and the fact that they are being forced to become Spanish culture makes them unhappy. It doesn't make them in control of their own life, and they can do whatever they like to do. But it doesn't make them happy. We saw that in Catalonia, really, right? 40 years ago. Secondly, you get like the extremists, like the Basques, like the ETA. Terrorist attacks to violently oppose these motions, one. Secondly, to ask for like attention for their problems, to send a message to the world, look, we are being discriminated against. And without even judging terrorism, if it's legal, if it's like justifiable or not, people are dying because of this, and that is never a good idea, especially since the situation is stable now. Thirdly, we say like political elites, they're trying for separatism, right? Catalonians, pretty strong viable area, say, all right, let's screw this, we're forming our own nation, Spaniards, goodbye, and that will create like conflict within that country, not necessarily making people happy. So, in conclusion, my final take is we say we are better off in the status quo. We are better off where these majorities in Belgium, Spain, Nigeria, and all these other countries are actually happy to create their own lives, with the exception of foreign policy and international relations. Because they are happy, we say, don't create all these problems. That will happen. On-site opposition, philosophically wrong, practically wrong, vote opposition. Thank you.
Okay, I now call upon the final speaker from closing opposition. Closing governance, sorry.
I'm very disappointed today of this debate because what happened from this side is they took a very I could describe it as a cowardly stance to only look at the extremes and not actually clash us on the range where this motion is actually relevant. And they only went to the right extreme and the left extreme. They basically told us, if Muslims exist in our society, you are telling us that we should either kill them, or in the other case, detriment means that we just generally feel threatened. So these two extremes they took, we do not accept. We're not saying we're gonna kill Muslims just because they're Muslim. We're not claiming that at all. We never did. On the other hand, we never claimed that detriment will mean that generally someone feeling threatened by something irrational. We never got to that far. We said detriment is where it actually affects society. I will get into that some more. Now, because of this confusion and because I see that there was no real clash on the range where we actually put this motion, unfortunately I only have one clash for you, which is just to go through these points and how they actually totally missed us. Now, what we heard from the first opening team on this side is basically one idea in both their speeches, and it was about multiculturalism is good and we want to preserve it in nations of the world. Now, I will show you first how we agree with them that multiculturalism is actually good generally, and secondly I will show you that they misunderstood us and misrepresented us in the way they claimed we would hurt multiculturalism, and further I will show you how we prove to you, especially in our extension speech, that actually by doing the supporting the motion, we will protect minorities more than they do. We will create more acceptance of these minorities by going with our side. No, thank you, not right now. So let me get into that idea first because I see it as the most important. They told us that acceptance generates from interaction, so we should keep these minorities around. Now, firstly, we never claimed that we're not going to keep the minorities around. We said that only when they are detrimental, and we gave you examples in our extension where this goes against the law, for example, in drug festivals, or where people try to enforce their education beliefs on us, where it's something that prevents the general public from being scientifically aware, and we think these things hurt us, and so we wouldn't accept that. But generally, we do accept, of course, the culture in our society. And this was already emphasized by the first speaker on this bench by saying the model that we're using is we're just simply not going to pass bills that we see hurt us. So it's not generally just because someone exists, lives next door, you will do something about it. Now, acceptance by interaction. They told us that any kind of interaction is going to create acceptance. No. When Muslim people, for example, in Sweden go out and hurt themselves with chains, this does not create acceptance, believe you me. People get a wrong picture of how Islam is a peaceful religion, actually, if you claim that. So when people see that, they misunderstand that because they don't really understand these inherent things in the culture. And so by just assuming that this is violent and this is a violent religion, that's what happens. We create less acceptance. So what we do on this side is we're restricting the characteristics of these minority cultures that actually appear very harmful and very negative to the majority. And so by doing this, we're actually protecting these minorities more. This was implied by my partner by explaining to you all these examples where it's just simply unacceptable, where, for example, children are prevented from getting cancer treatment just because their parents believe that they should pray it away and not deal with it with the scientific medical way. No, thank you. And so we think this is very, very hurtful to us and to all these people. No. So herd and minority rights, they said we need to help these minorities because specifically they need this help. Yes, this is covered under the point I already explained to you, that we want to help them. No, thank you, not at this time. We want to help these minorities, and that's the way we're going to do it. The way they're claiming is not really going to help them at all. It's just going to create more misunderstanding because they're allowing even the things that are detriment to the majority. The majority will see that those things are hurting them, and they will not accept those people because they're attacking them in a way or another. No. No. So later they told us in their extension we have a major contradiction, that we have a kind of a hypocritical idea that we don't let these cultures infringe on us, but we put our cultures down their throat. Now this is not correct. For example, in states where most people are not gay, we have allowed gay marriage, for example. So we actually accept minority ideals that we don't deem hurtful to us. So we actually promote them. If they're promoting something nice and something that doesn't hurt us, we help them with that. What's wrong with that? But if it's something that's going to hurt us, if they're going to force me to be gay, I'm probably going to say no, thank you. So no, thank you. So there is no contradiction there. No. So actually, we are more protective of them by making sure there is no misunderstanding. That is the point we brought to you, and we made it real in our extension only by bringing you these examples that paint the real picture. I'll take closing.
Spanish government in the 60s fought Basque language as a threat to their national unity and therefore fought it for 40 years with terrorism. How is that not relevant in your case? Try rebutting my case.
I don't understand this example. I'm sorry, I apologize, but I'll just move on, and hopefully you'll get the answer to your questions in my general rebuttal, which I included your general principle arguments. Now, what he told us, this wonderful speaker, he's told us that we're going to be doing two things. We're going to be sending messages to the minorities. We're saying we don't respect your culture, we don't accept it. No, we're not going to be doing that. We've told you that. We are going to protect them. We allow them to have their cultures. We allow them to practice their beliefs in private. If they're going to affect it on the big domain, yeah, I'll take it.
Sir, you've been saying this is a debate about minorities cannot pass policies that hurt the majority. But can you please explain how in a democracy a minority can ever possibly pass a bill that hurts
They shouldn't. It's not going to happen, and they shouldn't. Minorities should not be able to pass bills that hurt the majority. If they hurt the majority, they should not pass them. That's what we're saying. If they're actually hurtful, we don't want them to pass them. But if it's something that's not hurtful, people, the majority, we believe, will generally agree with this and will say, you know, we passed this, just as we saw with drugs in certain states and with allowing prostitution and with allowing gay marriage and these things we've already brought to you. But if people are going to promote things that are against the law, if people are going to promote things that are going to make people end up dying because they cannot be diagnosed because of some religious belief, we don't think that this is going to have a good effect, and so people will vote it down. And we think that creates a natural balance of survival of the fittest parts of cultures, and that's where you create good multiculturalism. That's why we propose. Thank you.
I'm really unhappy about the way closing government treated this debate. What I'm going to do first is what this debate has been about, what it should be about. Secondly, I'm going to talk about two clashes I saw in this debate. First of all, in which world do we have most loss of culture? And this clash actually applies to all the examples given by both government and opposition. So that's why we already win this debate. Secondly, I will talk about happiness of people in countries, minorities, as well as majorities. So firstly, what we've heard from closing government. Because what they told you is that we are going to extremes. and that is by giving us the burden to say committing crimes is a very good thing. Committing terrorism is a very good thing. This is not what our burden is about. We think that has never happened in any Western liberal democracy. We have seen other things happening, like Jeroen explained. He explained about what has been the policy in the real world in Spain. They have been ignoring the case that Jeroen has brought. That's not the same as dealing with it. So what we say this language is about is, for instance, that Spain example. To clarify it, what has happened in the real world is that the Basque minority has their own language. The Spanish majority said together, okay, we feel threatened by your language, by having this language. So the policy that we saw in Spain was that they actively tried not to teach, that the government policy was not to teach the Basque language in any school in Spain. We say, we have seen that led to terrorism from Basque extremists and from the moderate Basque people, that they felt very unhappy with that. We think that is a relevant case. We say in many cases we see that there has to go more government spending to protect things like minority languages. That is the detriment of the majority to whom that money does not go. We say those are the cases that we're talking about. So actually, they are going to extremes by telling what our burden is. We think this is a fairly straightforward debate that I've had in the past a couple of times. No, thank you. Let's go on to what we saw in this debate about the clashes. So, first of all, in which world do we have most loss of culture? Because that's already what opening government has told you. Okay, with the example in France, if we would allow burqas, within a couple of years, we would only have burqas in France. You would have great loss of the French culture. We say that is not going to happen, because what we see in France is that you have the vast majority who doesn't like wearing burqas, who is, for instance, Christian or atheist and will never wear a burqa, and that they will not be going to harm in that way. So the majority always has the means to keep the culture intact the way it is. So we see that is not the relevant case. What we do see, however, is the very relevant point that has only been brought into the debate by Jeroen, by many stateless minorities. Because what opening government also said is, okay, if we have majority policies that are harming minorities, then what is going to happen? They should go back to the country where they came from. Many of those minorities are simply not able to do that, or don't want to do that, because they feel home at the place where they live in. So what is happening in that case is that we actually have assimilation there. Because those people have to assimilate to the culture, because it will be government policy, the majority policy, to get them assimilated. That's, for instance, what we saw in Spain by teaching only Castilian language in schools. That's also what we saw in Belgium, where they're actually in some parts not teaching Flemish. So we see assimilation there, and we don't have this culture anywhere else in the world, because those are stateless minorities and they can't get away from that. So we see that we have more loss of culture in our world, no matter in what world we view this debate according to their definitions or our definitions. So if we all like this multicultural society the most, then we win this debate. Second half.
Would you ban the teaching of evolution in the Netherlands if a minority of Muslims requests that?
No, that is not the case. What you have been trying to tell about education is that we say, would you be okay with teaching, for instance, creationism, if there's a small minority in the Netherlands that believes in creationism? And we say, yes, in that case, we think we can have more of those ideas. We can say, okay, this is the opinion that some people have, this is the culture that they have. We think in that case, you could say, okay, that takes away time from the majority culture. We say, we're fine by that, and that is what this debate is about. No, thank you. So we see this marketplace of cultures. We think that actually is a good thing. Second clash and last clash. The happiness of people. Because this is also a point that has been brought by both government teams. That we see For instance, with the burqa example again in France, they say, yeah, it's a very huge problem to the majority because they feel slightly unsafer if they see once a month someone who wears a burqa. We say that's not that much of a problem. That's not what utilitarianism is about. Because what they prefer is a policy in which all Islamic women are attacked in the core of their identity because they're not allowed to act in the way that their religion tells them to act. So we say to them, it destroys their whole way of life, but to the majority of the people, it doesn't destroy their way of life, but they feel slightly unsafer. We say in that way, the utilitarian calculus also falls on our side. So what do we also see about minority cultures? That because you have a certain culture, your identity is all about that culture. Because you might think in a certain language that shapes the way you live, that shapes the way you think. So you base your happiness on that. You have certain views of norms in society, of how to behave. We think you're happy because of that. So if the government gives you the signal, okay, we don't care what you as a minority have, or that you cannot go anywhere, but we will never try to defend your minority culture because it might be a slight inconvenience to the majority, and in all cases we always prefer what they might find slightly inconvenient. We say that is not the world we want to live in. We think that's a fundamentally unfair world. It will lead to bad consequences. It might even lead to terrorism. That's not what we want to have on our hands. Please vote opposition.